Welcome back, minors. My name is Tracy Kriegel. I'm a counselor here at the Wellbeing Center.
Hi, and my name is Amber Johnston. I'm also a counselor at Student Wellbeing, and it's time for your Morning Cup with Joe.
So today we're going to talk about stress and what is stress mean to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the limbic system works. Amber, does that sound like something we can talk about a little bit today?
Oh man, I know stress.
Yeah, I think all of us as students and professionals, people working today, even our stay-at-home moms, and we all are familiar with what stress is today. So if you're not familiar with the limbic system, you're going to get a little bit of education about that, and Amber's going to talk to you also today about what are we talking about? The show?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. I think all of you who are movie buffs out there are going to be able to, TV show watchers are going to know what Game of Thrones is about. So let's just get right into it today. So talking about the limbic system. The limbic system is at the base of the brain. So it consists of the amygdala, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. It's the so-called lizard brain, if you're familiar with that term. And it's like a brain chemical regulator. It communicates with the endocrine system in order to communicate the chemicals, the brain. It's like a regulator. It communicates with the endocrine system in order to communicate the chemicals in the brain and the blood need in order to function and survive. So without this system, we're not going to survive. So the amygdala specifically is like a giant control center. So if you're into games, it's like that computer brain. Without it, we're not functioning. So if the electric goes out, we got to have some major backup generator. So the limbic system is the key control that we've got to have working. So it's the home of our mood and our addictions, and it's very primitive. And so just kind of like an analogy, if you see a tiger and our brain registers that there's a tiger in the room, the amygdala determines what emotions we feel about it. And then it transmits signals to the endocrine system in support of the chemicals that we need. So if the amygdala registers that we should feel fear, it's going to trigger the endocrine system to produce chemicals and distribute them throughout the body to prepare us to either run away or to fight. So there's not a lot of people that I've known that's just going to stand there and say, yep, that's a tiger. I'm just going to stand here and just say, hey, buddy, how you doing today?
Well, but if the tiger's in a cage, then your amygdala may not be activated.
True.
And it may just be like, oh, he's not a threat.
True.
But if he's pacing around and he's like, just hanging out in the room you're in, then your amygdala is letting go like, oh, there's a tiger. Oh, there's a tiger. Oh, there's a tiger.
Right, true. So it depends on the context of where you're seeing that tiger. So good point, Amber. So if the amygdala registers that we should feel fear, it's going to be it'll trigger the endocrine system to produce those chemicals and distribute them throughout the body to prepare us to either do that runaway or to flight. So it's commonly referred to as the flight or fight response. So, however, there's two more of those important F's in that acute response, stress response, and that's the freeze or the flop, or what we call the fawn as well. So the amygdala also regulates other emotions other than just fear, and it's responsible for interpreting the stimuli. So it also governs things like the sex drive and drug addiction. So to remember what things are controlled by the limbic system, we're going to refer to those as the 4 F's. Again, those are the fight, the flight, the feed, and the fornicate. So we're putting a little different spin on those. So remember them again, the fight, the flight, the feed, and the fornicate. So sounds simple, right? So the short version is that the part of the brain controls our basic desires.
This is where we would want to cue Lucifer Morningstar from the show Lucifer saying, what is your desire?
So when we become stressed through either acute or through chronic stress, our limbic system responds in a way to protect us. Thank God we have protection. Again, this is our primal brain, not our frontal cortex. And it sometimes does not do a very good job of differentiating between the two types of threats. or many types of threats. It simply knows that there's a threat. It could be a test, or it could be a tiger.
Yeah.
So
our brain is not great at being able to tell the difference between a test and a tiger, unfortunately.
So our limbic system can sometimes react to a test like it's a tiger, and then we have a problem. So the feelings of a chronically overreactive limbic system are the symptoms we commonly associate with that big word, anxiety, and chronic stress responses. Today we're going to focus on acute stress responses, and in the next episode we'll center on chronic stress responses. So in terms of acute stress responses, we typically only say fight or flight, as those are the most common. However, stress responses can take a few other routes as well. So let's examine them by using the popular series that Amber is going to tell us about, the Game of Thrones. And I think they are under a lot of stress, both acute and chronic. So what do you think, Amber?
I think that's an understatement. That show just stresses me out watching it.
Right,
It's a very stressful show. I can't imagine how the characters are in it. And for those of you who haven't seen the series, it's like in our past references, will be generic enough to not provide too many spoilers and enough background knowledge to make it easy to kind of understand the concepts. So the Game of Thrones series is set in a fictional land called Westeros, and it's a continent that's ruled by several families united under a single king. It's very similar to the feudal system in Europe in the past, and the main part of the story centers on one family, and the family rules area of the northern part of the map they call the North, and it's the Starks. In short, the whole series is about political espionage, the fight for the Iron Throne, or in other words, everybody's trying to be king all of the same continent at the same time, and there's a lot of people die and betray each other and stab each other in the back, and a whole lot of secrets and drama. Yeah, a lot of drama.
Nah, no drama.
No, not at all. So let's start easy. And we're going to talk about an example of the fight response. Fight is a very common acute stress response, and we see it frequently in the Game of Thrones. So like when Arya attacks... Arya and her friend Micah are playing down by the river, and Joffrey comes up and he sees them, and Joffrey attacks her friend Micah with a real sword, and so Arya becomes very defensive of her friend, and so after Joffrey cuts Micah's face with this sword, Arya stands up for Micah and taking on Joffrey, striking him with the stick, and she's just got a stick and he's got a sword, and she strikes him with the stick until he's literally laying on the ground. And he heavily outmatches her with this very real, very sharp sword. And eventually her dire wolf jumps on him, knocks him to the ground, and attacks him. And so this is the fight response. I mean, she's literally fighting with a stick. Is that coming from a logical part of her brain? I mean, not only is he the king's son, he's literally the king's son, and she's just a noble daughter, and she's attacking him. This wasn't a logical decision on her part. This was a limbic response.
Yeah, she's got to protect herself.
Yes. And in this case, it wasn't just herself. It was her friend Micah. So this is an excellent example of the flight response. When she's faced with the threat and that her friend Micah could be hurt, Arya jumps in and fights Joffrey. Even though her stick is certainly no match for his sword, you can see how the limbic system has overrun the logic parts of the brain. She isn't thinking, and instead she throws herself into danger to protect her friend. Not saying that her actions were inappropriate. It's just saying that the limbic system is set up to just react without thinking, which is a good thing when we're in danger, because we don't want to think. If there's a tiger in the room, we don't want to sit here and ponder it all out. Our body wants us to run and get away from the tiger.
Right. Well, and I think that's that natural protective instinct. Thankfully, the limbic system will say, hey, react.
Yes.
And that's exactly what she did. So she just instinctively, instead of thinking through it, she reacted.
Yes. So another great example of the limbic system activation is when Theon jumps off of the boat, leaving his sister behind. So in this episode, Theon's sister is helping him escape from a very traumatic and violent situation. So he's been traumatized. She's come and she saved him. They're leaving, and they're traveling home, and the boat's attacked. So he's just been a captive. He's been through all of this trauma, and the boat is now attacked. And he panics, and he literally just jumps off the boat into the ocean and swims away and leaves his sister and everybody on the boat, abandons them. So meanwhile, your brain's going, I can't believe he just did that. She risked her life and everything to come save him, and then this happens and he just runs away and leaves her. Like, how could he do this? So there's been a lot of criticism that he abandoned his sister who just saved him, when in fact he most likely probably wasn't thinking at all. He was traumatized, his limbic system took over, and he probably just fell victim to his limbic system telling him to fight.
Gotta get away.
Yeah, got to get away, because he'd been previously captured, he'd been tortured. When he faced the idea of being captured and tortured again, that was just too much. And so he panicked, he jumped off the boat, and the logical part of his brain never had a chance to kick in. This reaction was purely base instinct.
Yeah, when your brain is fine-tuned, and that's what the instinct was, he ran.
And that's the thing about these limbic responses, is we have to remember that when we have these limbic responses, the logical part of our brain has shut off.
Right.
So our next acute stress response is freeze. And this is a good example of this is like the deer in the headlights, where you're kind of just like staring at somebody blankly. The best example that I can think of this is when Walder Frey is standing giving a speech to his men at dinner, celebrating his political victories and bemoaning and shortcomings. At this point, he stops his wife from drinking her wine. So they're all standing there, they're getting ready to toast, and he stops her from drinking. He notices that the people around him are just kind of falling over dead. He freezes, as does his young wife next to him, and just standing there watching as person after person starts choking and falling over dead. And you think my freeze example is Walder Frey, but I'm actually talking about his wife, because the person that's standing there wasn't actually Walder Frey. It was somebody who was impersonating him, who had already murdered Walder Frey, Arya.
Interesting.
And so she had killed the entire Frey clan over the course of a couple episodes. And Walder's wife just watches as all the men in the hall die. And she continues to just stand there, almost calmly. That's the interesting part about the freeze response, is there's just almost a calmness to it. While everyone there is just falling over dead, and the person who looks like her husband is revealed to be a young girl, not even her husband, and relays that she's just also murdered her husband and everyone else. So through all this, the wife just kind of stands there and watches this all happen.
Yeah, it's kind of like just in shock and awe of like, can't think, no response, I'm just stopped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very much shock. Like, brain isn't even functioning
No
or registering
function.
anything at that point. So my final reaction that I want to talk about is flop or faint. This acute stress response, the person might actually faint or just become limp and compliant. I couldn't recall of any examples of fainting in Game of Thrones when I was trying to come up with stuff, but that doesn't mean they're not there. I just couldn't remember any. However, this reaction made me think of Samwell Tarly when he's training with the Night Watch. In the very, very beginning of the series. Night Watch is basically this border military installment that's right along this wall. And on one side of the wall, you have this very wild north that has all kinds of mythical kind of creatures on it that are very dangerous and deadly and just not good. And then the other side, you have civilization. And so the wall is really a line between this frozen, uninhabitable, quote, quote, land to the north, and then where all the people live. And they're kind of holding the line, trying to keep everybody on the people's side safe. And so they send people there, kind of like they would in the past send younger sons to monasteries and stuff. In the shows, they're sending these younger sons and bastard sons to the wall because it was something honorable for them to do. And so that's why Samwell Tarly got sent there. And he's a bigger guy, probably not very athletic, and he's being mocked a lot. And he goes into this combat situation, and he refuses to even pick up a sword. Like, he is a intellectual. He's very much not a fighter, and so he's just completely refusing to pick up the sword. And they're supposed to be in this combat situation where they're training, and he doesn't even want to get involved with it. And he allows the other students to essentially just beat him as he just lays there in the mud and lets it happen. He just kind of flops on the ground after he's struck the first time, and then begs for them to stop. So this entire time he just keeps begging them to stop. And notice the difference between the freeze response, where she just kind of stood there, and the flop response, where you just become limp and just kind of fall down like Samwell Tarly. And that's kind of the difference between those. This one, with Samwell Tarly, he became passively compliant. He's just kind of there. So this person just becomes limp as opposed to stiff, and Samwell doesn't even ever try to defend himself.
Maybe something could kind of just throw this out there too. Some maybe a medical way for people kind of to understand that as well is if you got a really bad cut and it was the first time you saw blood, and you might just faint at the sight of blood. That might be another way that people understand. Fawning or fainting as well, because you just can't, your limbic system just stops reacting to a stress. So that's an acute stress response, as your body just doesn't, it's a medical response, but the stress related to the event becomes too overwhelming that you can't cope with the reaction of what's happening as well. So you just kind of, your body just faints. It's not that you're in a medical crisis, but you faint at the sight of what's happening. So that's also an acute stress reaction as well that the limbic system has. So that's kind of another kind of descriptor of that too, and maybe help people understand that. So
right. These acute stress responses are something that we do almost instantly, and we do it without thinking in response to a threat. So like we said before, everything that we've covered, none of these responses were thought out. The characters that we spoke about, they didn't spend time wondering if this was a logical thing to do, or if this was something that would work well for them in the future, or help them achieve their goals. Like, they weren't having thoughts like this. This was a panic response. This was an impulse that they reacted to because of the activation of the limbic system. They differ from the responses of an ongoing stressor or threat. So like when we have a chronic stress or threat, the stress responses are going to be different than these acute ones. This would be possible responses when you get startled, as opposed to chronic stress like worrying about grades. So why is this information important? It's important so that you can understand that if you act in a way that's unexpected in an emergency, sometimes people don't always know how they're going to act in an emergency until they're faced with one. You have people that are very timid that get in an emergency, and they're the ones leading and giving commands. And then you have people that are very assertive in real life, and they get into an emergency and they freeze up, and they can't string two words together. And so that's a limbic, those are both limbic responses, and we don't know how our limbic system is going to react. It can also help you if you're a bystander and you want to help. For example, if somebody's in the freeze response and you're in an emergency, you can give them commands and they will follow them. If you tell them to go call 911, they will go call 911. Make sure to tell them to come back, because after they fulfill that, their limbic system is going to shut down again and they're going to wander off. So tell them, call 911 and come back. But understanding that gives us that option of, okay, how do I handle this in an emergency situation? If you give basically, like I said, we've just using this knowledge of our acute stress responses as a tool, and understanding how we work really helps us plan for emergencies and understand how we react, and especially if we act in ways that we don't feel good about afterwards. Like, why did I do that? Like Theon, why did I jump off that boat and leave them behind? Instead of struggling with that grief and that guilt, he can really understand that, okay, I did this because I wasn't thinking. My limbic system kicked in.
So if we're dealing with the acute stress, I just wanted to throw this out to all of us, because we don't know when we're going to be dealing with some of the acute stressors. We here at the Wellness Center, one of the things we really want to, encourage you to think about is, what are some of those good coping skills you can do to help yourself deal with those acute stress moments. And so there's cards we give out to a lot of our students here, but this is just a takeaway that you can take away today from this podcast. And so if you're listening and you want to just write this down, or if you want to just do this with us at this moment, this is a takeaway. It's called a 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. And so think of this just as a way, when you get overwhelmed or stressed, think of 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. This is just a simple grounding technique that can bring your mind to a safe space, because when our limbic system gets overactivated, we need to be able to come to a nice calm space. And when we're using all 5 of our senses, we need to be able to get to a nice calm safe space. Mm-hmm. So again, that's a 5-4-3-2-1. 5 things you see, 4 things you touch, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, 1 thing you taste.
Well, and it also can help activate your brain so that you can actually think again. Because your limbic system, when it's activated, when we do a grounding technique, we're basically tricking our body into realizing that there's not a tiger in the room, right. That there actually is not any immediate threat, and I can actually stop producing all these chemicals and hormones and pumping it through my body, and I can relax a little bit, and our brain, our cerebral cortex can kick in, and we can actually start thinking and coming up with positive reactions that move towards our goals and the things that we want to get done. So doing these grounding techniques, and we talked about quite a few of them in the mindfulness episode. Right. So if you guys want to learn more about grounding techniques and other mindfulness techniques, please go back and listen to our mindfulness episode. There's tons of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's, I think us taking care of ourselves and using good self-care techniques are just going to help us grow and find that safe space within us, so that we can deactivate that limbic system to find, stability and emotional regulation. And that's where we all want to be, because we're never going to be free of stress.
No.
But it's those acute stressors that activate the limbic system. And so being able to take charge of those stressors, grounding techniques are those pieces that help us to take charge of the things that activate us.
Right. Well, and if we didn't have any stress, we would never get anything done. We'd have no motivation to get out of bed. We have no motivation to do our homework. Like, stress, it causes us to get the things done we need to do to survive. That anxiety producing, we have to have a certain level of anxiety in order to survive.
Yeah, it's positive.
Yeah, it's positive. It's the motivator. It's the kickstarter. It's the thing that keeps us going. What we're talking about in this episode, and when we go over the chronic stress response, is more the what happens when it becomes too much.
Right.
Like, what happens when it's overactivated, and how to cope with that. Because that's what really these are. The acute stress response is really an overactivation of the limbic system.
Right, exactly.
So...
Very good.
Okay, well, thank you guys for joining us, and you have a great day. For more information about mental health and wellness, contact contact Student Wellbeing at 204 Norwood Hall. And you can also give us a call at 573-341-4211.
The song Happy Days is brought to us by music from www.free-stock-music.com. You can also add and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook using our handle at S&T Wellbeing.